Marcus Webb had learned to keep his phone on silent during quarterly presentations. 14 years at Pinnacle Financial had taught him that much. 14 years of 6 a.m. arrivals and midnight spreadsheets. 14 years of watching other men miss their children's birthdays, while he told himself it was temporary, that the sacrifice would eventually mean something. His daughter Lily was 9 years old. He had missed 6 of her 9 birthdays. The phone buzzed against the mahogany conference table, and Marcus ignored it. Across from him, 3 representatives from the Hargrove account studied the projections he'd spent 11 days preparing. Beside him, his colleague Derek Chen sat perfectly still, the practiced stillness of a man who understood that this meeting represented $7 million in annual revenue. The phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Marcus silenced it without looking up. The Q3 projections account for market volatility through the end of fiscal. The phone buzzed a third time. Something cold moved through Marcus's chest. Not instinct exactly, more like memory. The memory of every time he'd ignored a feeling and paid for it later. The memory of his own father saying once, near the end, that the things you regret most aren't the mistakes you made, but the moments you stood still when everything in you was telling you to move. He glanced down. Riverside Elementary School. "Excuse me," he said, standing before he'd made the conscious decision to stand. "I apologize. I need to take this." Derek's eyes went wide. The Hargrove representatives exchanged a glance that Marcus recognized immediately. The glance of men calculating whether this interruption would affect their confidence in Pinnacle Financial, in Marcus specifically, in the $7 million they were considering entrusting to his hands. One of them, a silver-haired man named Alderman, who wore his authority like an expensive watch, set his pen down on the table with a small, deliberate click. Marcus walked out of the conference room anyway. The hallway was carpeted in that deep corporate grey that swallowed sound. He answered on the 4th ring, just before it would have gone to voicemail. "Mr. Webb." The voice on the other end was careful, measured, the voice of someone who had delivered difficult news before and had learned to approach it slowly. "This is Principal Okafor at Riverside Elementary. I need you to come in as soon as possible." "What happened? Is Lily hurt?" "Lily is physically fine." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to terrify him. "But there's been an incident. We've been trying to reach her mother as well, but her mother lives in Portland," Marcus said. "I'm her primary guardian. I'm coming now." He hung up and stood in the hallway for exactly 3 seconds. Through the glass wall of the conference room, he could see Derek smoothly filling the silence, gesturing toward the projections on the screen, recalibrating. Derek was good at recalibrating. It was why Marcus had brought him into the meeting in the first place, because Derek could read a room the way a sailor reads weather and adjust before anyone noticed the wind had changed. Marcus sent him a text. "Family emergency. Close this however you need to. I trust you." Then he walked to his office, took his coat from the hook behind the door, told his assistant Sandra he would explain later, and left the building. The elevator took 45 seconds to reach the lobby. He counted. It was a habit from the early days, when he used to count things to keep himself steady. Seconds, steps, the number of ceiling tiles in a room. He'd thought he'd outgrown it. Apparently not. The lobby was marble and glass and the particular hush of money being managed on 37 floors above. Marcus pushed through the revolving door and stepped into November air that tasted like rain. He didn't know, walking out through the entrance of the building where he'd spent the better part of his adult life, that he wouldn't be coming back the same way he'd left. Principal Okafor's office smelled like old coffee and the particular anxiety of a room where difficult conversations happened regularly. Lily sat in a chair that was slightly too large for her, her feet not quite touching the floor, her backpack clutched in her lap like a shield. She was wearing the blue sweater Marcus had bought her in October, the one with the small embroidered stars along the collar that she'd pointed to in a store window and said, "Dad, look," in that quiet way she had, like she was asking permission to want something. She didn't look up when Marcus came in. That scared him more than anything Principal Okafor had said on the phone. "Lily." He crouched down in front of her chair. "Hey, look at me." She looked up. Her eyes were dry, which somehow made it worse. Lily was a crier. She cried at commercials about dogs. She cried when they had to throw away flowers that had wilted. The fact that her eyes were dry meant she had moved past the crying stage into something quieter and harder. "I'm sorry you had to leave your meeting," she said. The sentence hit him somewhere specific, somewhere that had been accumulating damage for years. "Don't apologize for that," he said. "Ever, okay? Don't ever apologize for that." Principal Okafor cleared her throat from behind her desk. She was a tall woman with reading glasses pushed up into her hair and the careful posture of someone who spent her days navigating between children's pain and institutional obligation. Marcus had met her twice before. Once at orientation, once when Lily won the third-grade reading award. Both times she had smiled easily. She was not smiling now. "Mr. Webb, thank you for coming so quickly. I want to walk you through what happened, and then I think it would be good for you and Lily to talk privately." Marcus stood, but kept one hand on the arm of Lily's chair. "Go ahead." During lunch today, Lily was involved in an altercation with another student, a boy in her class named Bryce Keller. According to the lunch monitor, Bryce was taunting Lily about— She glanced at Lily, then back at Marcus. About her family situation, specifically about her mother's absence. Lily asked him to stop. He didn't. She threw her lunch tray at him. Marcus looked down at his daughter. She was staring at a fixed point on the carpet with the concentration of someone trying to hold something inside by sheer force of will. The tray struck Bryce in the chest. No injury, but we have a zero-tolerance policy regarding physical responses to conflict, which means Lily is facing a 3-day suspension. "She's 9, Marcus said. "I understand, and I want to be clear that I've also spoken with Bryce's parents about his behavior, but the policy applies uniformly. I don't have discretion here." Marcus nodded. Not because he agreed, but because he recognized the architecture of the conversation. He'd spent 14 years in rooms where people explained that their hands were tied while sitting comfortably behind desks. "Can I have a minute with her?" Principal Okafor stood. "Of course. Take as long as you need. I'll be just outside." The door clicked shut. The room got very quiet. Marcus pulled a chair around so he was sitting directly across from Lily, their knees almost touching. "What did he say to you?" Lily's fingers tightened on the backpack straps. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." A long silence, the kind that has weight and texture, the kind that a 9-year-old shouldn't know how to carry. "He said my mom left because I was too boring to love." Marcus felt something rearrange itself inside his chest. Not break, rearrange. Like a wall he'd built in a particular configuration, suddenly proving inadequate for what it needed to hold. "Lily, I know it's not true." She said it fast, the way people say things they're trying to believe. "I know, you don't have to say it." But the way she was gripping that backpack told him everything she wasn't saying. That knowing something wasn't true, and feeling it wasn't true, was separated by a distance she hadn't figured out how to cross. That she'd been carrying this particular weight for longer than today. That she had learned, somewhere along the way, to carry things quietly. She had learned that from him. Marcus drove home with Lily in the back seat, silent behind her seatbelt, her backpack still clutched against her chest. He watched her in the rearview mirror more than he watched the road. She was looking out the window, but not at anything. That unfocused gaze children get when they're trying to make themselves smaller than the space they occupy. Principal Okafor had explained it carefully. A group of girls in Lily's class had been excluding her for weeks. Small things at first. Saved seats that were suddenly taken. Whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Then it escalated. Notes passed around. A ranking list someone had made of every girl in the class, with Lily's name at the bottom, annotated with reasons. The list had been photographed and shared on a parent's old iPad that one of the girls had brought to school. Lily had found the list during lunch. She'd read every word of it in the cafeteria, surrounded by the girls who'd written it, and then she'd walked to the bathroom and stayed there for 40 minutes until a teacher came looking. She hadn't cried then either, Principal Okafor said. She'd just sat on the floor of the bathroom with her knees drawn up and asked, very politely, if she could please call her dad. Marcus pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. He sat there for a moment, both hands on the wheel. His phone had 17 notifications. He could see them stacked on the screen without picking it up. Derek had texted 4 times. Sandra had called twice. There was an email from his division head, Richard Ames, with a subject line he could partially read. Hargrove meeting. Need to discuss imed. He turned the phone face down on the passenger seat. You want mac and cheese? He asked, looking at Lily in the mirror. The real kind, not the box. She met his eyes for the first time since the school. Something moved across her face. Not a smile. The ghost of the possibility of one. With the breadcrumbs on top. Obviously with the breadcrumbs on top. He made the mac and cheese. He grated the cheddar by hand and mixed in the Gruyere he'd been saving for a dinner party he kept planning and never hosting. He crushed the breadcrumbs with the heel of his palm and watched butter brown in the cast-iron skillet his mother had given him when Lily was born, the one she'd said he'd need more than he thought. Lily sat at the kitchen table and drew in her sketchbook. She didn't talk about what had happened. Marcus didn't push. He'd learned from his own father the damage that pushing could do, the way a forced conversation could make a child feel like their pain was a problem to be managed rather than a thing to be witnessed. So he witnessed. He stayed in the kitchen, and he grated cheese, and he let the silence be what it needed to be. While the mac and cheese baked, he checked his phone in the hallway where Lily couldn't see. 23 notifications now. Derek's last text read, Hargrove reps left, said they need to reconvene. Richard is asking questions. Call me when you can. Marcus stared at the message for a long time. $7 million. 14 years of work building toward a moment that had arrived on the same morning his daughter sat on a bathroom floor and asked to call him. The coincidence felt less like coincidence and more like a question he'd been refusing to answer, finally demanding a response. He put the phone in the drawer beside the front door. The junk drawer, Lily called it, where dead batteries and expired coupons and loose keys to forgotten locks accumulated. He set the phone on top of a takeout menu from a Thai restaurant that had closed 2 years ago. Then he went back to the kitchen, pulled the mac and cheese from the oven, and sat down across from his daughter. She ate 2 full servings. He watched her eat and felt something settling in his chest, like a decision that had already been made, long before he was conscious of making it. Marcus sat at the kitchen table at 11:47 p.m. with a legal pad and a pen he'd taken from the Pinnacle financial supply closet 6 years ago. The pen had the company logo on it. He'd never noticed that before. Lily was asleep. She'd fallen asleep on the couch around 9, her head on the armrest, one sock on and one sock off the way she always slept. And he'd carried her to bed and stood in her doorway for a long time listening to her breathe. She was heavy now. Not the way she'd been heavy at 2 or 3. That dense, compact weight of a toddler. Heavy like a person. Like a whole person who had been sitting in a principal's office, with dry eyes telling her father she was sorry he had to leave his meeting. He picked up the pen and started writing. He'd thought about doing this by email. Email was faster, cleaner, left a digital trail that could protect him later if things got complicated with his severance or his non-compete. But email was also the language of Pinnacle Financial, the medium through which he had conducted the better part of his professional life. And something about that felt wrong tonight. Something about typing this into the same interface where he'd sent 11,000 messages about quarterly projections and client retention strategies and conference room availability felt like it would reduce what he was doing to just another transaction. So he wrote it by hand. Dear Richard. He stopped. Started again. Richard, I am resigning from my position at Pinnacle Financial effective immediately. I understand this creates complications with the Hargrove account and with the Q4 transition plan. I understand the timing is, by any professional measure, indefensible. I am not going to try to defend it. He paused. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights sweeping across the kitchen ceiling and disappearing. I have given this company 14 years. I don't say that to claim I'm owed something. I say it because I need you to understand that what I'm doing tonight is not impulsive. It is the opposite of impulsive. It is the thing I should have done years ago and didn't, because I kept believing the next quarter would be different. The next promotion would buy me the flexibility I needed. The next milestone would be the one that finally let me be the father my daughter needs me to be. None of them were. You told me once that the people who succeed at Pinnacle are the ones who understand that sacrifice is not a season. It's a climate. I think you meant it as encouragement. I took it that way at the time, but I have a 9-year-old daughter who apologized to me today for making me leave a meeting, and I realized that the climate you were describing is one I've been raising her in. She has learned to make herself small so she doesn't interfere with my work. She has learned that the correct response to her own pain is to apologize for the inconvenience it causes. She learned that from watching me, Richard. She learned it from 14 years of me teaching her, through every missed dinner and every phone call I didn't take and every Sunday I spent in my home office with the door closed, that she comes second. She doesn't come second. I won't be serving a notice period. I know what that means for my severance package, and I've made my peace with it. Derek Chen is more than capable of managing the Hargrove transition, and I've left detailed notes on every active account in my office. Sandra has access to everything else. I wish I could say I'm grateful for my time at Pinnacle. Parts of it I am, but mostly I'm aware of what it cost, and tonight the bill came due in a way I can't ignore. Marcus Webb, he read it twice. He didn't change anything. The words had come out the way they needed to come out, which almost never happened with things he wrote for Pinnacle, where every sentence went through 4 rounds of revision and 2 layers of legal review. He folded the letter, put it in an envelope, and wrote Richard's name on the front. Then he set the stolen pen on top of the envelope and went to check on Lily one more time. The pasta was overcooked. Marcus stood at the stove stirring it anyway, because the act of stirring gave his hands something to do while his mind worked through the arithmetic of what came next. He had savings, enough for 8 months, maybe 10 if he cut everything that wasn't essential. The mortgage on the house was manageable but not small. Lily's school was public, so that wasn't a cost. But there were the after-school programs, the art supplies she went through like water, the therapist he'd already decided to find regardless of what the insurance situation looked like once his coverage lapsed. He drained the pasta and put it in 2 bowls, added butter and parmesan to both because Lily wouldn't eat red sauce and he'd stopped fighting that particular battle 2 years ago. He set the bowls on the kitchen table and called her name, and she came down the stairs in her socks, sliding the last 3 feet on the hardwood the way she always did, and the normalcy of that small gesture made his throat tight. They ate in a quiet that felt different from the usual quiet. Not strained, not empty. Something closer to the silence between 2 people who had said something true to each other and were still letting it settle. Lily twirled her fork in the pasta without lifting it to her mouth. "You're not eating," Marcus said. "Neither are you." He looked down. She was right. He picked up his fork and took a bite and she mirrored him. And they ate like that for a while, taking turns, a small unspoken game that made them both almost smile. He was rinsing the bowls when the doorbell rang. It was 20 minutes past 7 on a Tuesday evening. Marcus didn't get visitors on Tuesday evenings. He didn't get many visitors at all, if he was honest, because 14 years of prioritizing work had winnowed his social life down to colleagues and the parents of Lily's classmates, and those relationships existed primarily through email. He dried his hands on the dish towel and walked to the front door and opened it. Catherine Aldridge stood on his porch. For a moment, his brain simply refused to process what his eyes were reporting. Catherine Aldridge was the CEO of Pinnacle Financial. She ran a company with 4,000 employees and offices in 11 cities. She did not stand on porches in residential neighborhoods at 7:20 on Tuesday evenings. She existed in corner offices and boardrooms and the occasional Wall Street Journal profile. She did not exist here, on his welcome mat, under the porch light that he kept meaning to replace because it flickered. It was flickering now. "Marcus," she said. She was wearing a dark coat over what he recognized as the same clothes she'd had on at the office. No briefcase, no assistant trailing behind her. Just Catherine Aldridge, alone, standing on his porch with an expression he had never seen on her face in all the years he'd worked under her authority. She looked uncertain. Catherine Aldridge did not do uncertain. "May I come in?" she asked. Marcus realized he was still holding the dish towel. He stepped back and opened the door wider, and she walked in, and he watched her take in the hallway. The shoes lined up by the door, Lily's rain boots with the yellow ducks on them sitting next to his dress shoes. The contrast between those two pairs of footwear seemed to catch her attention for a moment longer than the rest. From upstairs came the faint sound of Lily's music. Something with a piano. She'd been playing the same album on repeat for weeks. "I read your letter," Catherine said. "I assumed you would. I read it 3 times. Marcus folded the dish towel, set it on the hall table, waited. Catherine Aldridge looked at the rain boots with the yellow ducks one more time, then looked at him. "We need to talk," she said. The doorbell rang a second time before Marcus moved. Lily had gone quiet in the kitchen, her spoon suspended halfway between the bowl and her mouth, watching him with that careful stillness children develop when they learn that unexpected things are rarely good things. "Stay here," he said. He crossed the living room in his socks, the resignation letter still open on his laptop screen where he'd left it, the cursor blinking at the end of the last line like a heartbeat he'd just flatlined. Through the frosted glass panel beside the front door, he could make out a figure, tall, winter coat, alone. Not a delivery. Deliveries didn't stand that still. Marcus opened the door. Catherine Aldridge stood on his porch. In 14 years at Pinnacle Financial, Marcus had been in the same room as the CEO perhaps a dozen times. Quarterly town halls, the annual holiday reception where she moved through the crowd with the efficient grace of someone who understood that her presence was itself a form of currency, to be spent carefully and never wasted. She was smaller than she appeared behind podiums and in shareholder letters, her silver hair cut close, her eyes the particular shade of grey that made you feel she was already 3 sentences ahead of wherever you thought the conversation was going. She had never been to his home. He had not known she had his address. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I realize this is unusual. That's one word for it. May I come in?" He almost said no. The refusal was right there sitting on his tongue, easy and justified. He had written the letter. He had made the decision. Whatever Pinnacle Financial wanted from him now existed on the other side of a line he had already crossed. But Catherine Aldridge had driven to his house on a Thursday evening, and there was something in the way she stood on his porch that didn't match the version of her he'd constructed over 14 years of distant observation. She looked like a person who had come to say something specific, and the specificity of it was costing her something. He stepped aside. She entered his living room and did not sit down. Her eyes moved across the space the way a person's eyes move when they are recalibrating an assumption. The framed drawings on the wall, Lily's shoes by the door, the stack of library books on the coffee table with a bookmark shaped like a caterpillar poking out of the top one. The evidence of a life that had been happening concurrently with the one Marcus had been living inside her building. Derek Chen closed the Hargrove account, she said. 7.2 million. He was very clear in his debrief that the groundwork was entirely yours. Marcus waited. Your resignation letter reached my desk 40 minutes ago. I don't typically involve myself in individual personnel decisions, but Sandra flagged it and I read it, and then I drove here, which I understand is not standard protocol. It isn't. No. She turned to face him fully. I've run Pinnacle for 11 years. In that time, I have received perhaps 200 resignation letters. Most of them are polite fictions, professional language designed to preserve relationships and protect references. Yours was not that. Marcus said nothing. He knew what he had written. He had chosen every word with the precision he usually reserved for client projections, except this time the numbers were ours and the losses were not hypothetical. You wrote that the company made it structurally impossible to be both a good employee and a present father. You wrote that you chose this job over your daughter for years, and that the choosing had finally broken something you could see. From the kitchen doorway, a small sound. Marcus glanced over. Lily stood there, her hand on the door frame, listening with the total attention of a child hearing her own story told back to her by a stranger. Catherine Aldridge looked at Lily, then back at Marcus. I didn't come here to convince you to stay, she said. Marcus sat on the front porch steps after Catherine Aldridge's car pulled away, and he stayed there for a long time. The street lights had come on. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking in that rhythmic, purposeless way dogs bark when they've forgotten why they started. The air had cooled enough that he could feel it on his forearms, where he'd rolled his sleeves up hours ago, back when he'd still been a man with a career, back when the biggest problem in his life had been whether Derek could close Hargrove without him. Derek had closed Hargrove without him. That much was clear from the text Marcus finally looked at, sitting there on the cold concrete. 17 messages. 8 from Derek, increasingly confused and then increasingly concerned. 4 from Sandra, who had apparently pieced together enough to be worried. 2 from colleagues who had heard something and wanted the story. 3 from numbers he didn't recognize, which probably meant the news had traveled the way news always traveled at Pinnacle, through the particular osmosis of people who spent too many hours in the same building, with too little to talk about besides each other. He didn't open any of them. Instead, he sat there and thought about what Catherine Aldridge had actually offered him, underneath the corporate language and the careful framing. She had offered him a version of his life that looked almost identical to the one he'd had that morning. Same title, same office, same trajectory. A few adjustments, she'd said. More flexibility. The implication being that Pinnacle understood, that Pinnacle valued him, that Pinnacle was willing to bend just enough to keep him inside the machine. $7 million. That was what the Hargrove account was worth annually. That was the number he'd been chasing when his phone buzzed 3 times on the mahogany table. That was the number that was supposed to justify the mornings he left before Lily woke up, and the evenings he came home after she'd already brushed her teeth and climbed into bed with a book she was reading alone because there was no one to read it to her. He thought about Lily's face in Principal Okafor's office, the dry eyes, the backpack held like armor, the way she'd apologized for making him leave his meeting, as though she had internalized so completely the hierarchy of his priorities that she ranked herself below a conference room full of strangers. He thought about what she'd drawn, the picture Mrs. Huang had found, the one that had started everything, a family portrait. The school counselor had explained gently, where Lily had drawn herself very small and her father as a briefcase with leg. No face, just a briefcase, walking away. Marcus pressed his palms against the concrete until the texture bit into his skin. The thing Catherine Aldridge didn't understand. The thing Marcus himself hadn't understood until he was crouching in front of his daughter's chair and watching her apologize for needing him, was that the problem had never been flexibility. The problem had never been schedule adjustments, or remote work options, or any of the structural accommodations that corporations offered like bandages over arterial wounds. The problem was that his daughter had drawn him without a face. The problem was that she'd been accurate. He went inside. The house was quiet. Lily's door was closed, a thin line of light visible underneath it, which meant she was still awake, probably reading, probably waiting to see if he'd knock. He'd told her they would talk more tomorrow. He'd told her things were going to be different. She had nodded in that careful way she'd developed, the nod of a child who had learned not to hold adults to their promises. He stood outside her door for a moment, then knocked softly. The light shifted. Footsteps. The door opened. She looked up at him and waited. He sat down on the floor in the hallway, his back against the wall, and said, "Want to tell me about the book you're reading?" Something moved across her face. Not trust exactly, but the space where trust might grow back. She sat down across from him and opened to the first page. The eggs were burning. Marcus could smell it from across the kitchen, that sharp, acrid edge that meant he'd looked away 30 seconds too long, and he grabbed the pan off the burner and scraped the mess onto a plate before it could set off the smoke detector again. Lily had opinions about the smoke detector. She told him once, very seriously, that the sound it made was what she imagined the inside of a headache looked like. He dumped the ruined eggs in the trash and started over. It was Tuesday. A regular Tuesday. The kind of morning that would have been unremarkable to anyone looking in from the outside. Lily's backpack sat by the front door, half-zipped, a library book poking out at an angle that suggested it had been shoved in without ceremony. Her shoes were lined up on the mat. Her jacket hung on the hook Marcus had installed at her height 3 years ago, the one she was almost too tall for now. He cracked 2 more eggs into the pan and watched them this time. The Hargrove account was gone. Derek had called the previous night to confirm what Marcus already knew. $7 million in annual revenue, walked out the door and signed with a competitor before the week was out. Sandra had forwarded 3 emails from upper management, each one more clipped than the last, each one asking Marcus to call at his earliest convenience in language that made clear his earliest convenience had better be immediate. He hadn't called. The letter he'd written was sitting in his sent folder, and every bridge it had burned was still smoldering, and he could feel the heat of it when he let himself think about it for too long. 14 years of equity, of accumulated credibility, of being the man who never missed and never wavered, and never once chose the inconvenient thing, all of it converted into smoke in the space of a single afternoon. And then Catherine Park had stood in his doorway and said what she'd said, and he still didn't entirely know what to do with it. The card she'd left was on the counter next to the coffee maker. He'd looked at it 4 times since yesterday. He hadn't picked it up yet. Lily came into the kitchen in her socks, sliding the last few feet on the hardwood the way she always did, and climbed onto her stool at the counter. Her hair was brushed. She'd done it herself. He could tell because the part was slightly crooked, veering left in a way that she either hadn't noticed or had decided she preferred. He put the plate in front of her. Eggs, toast, the strawberries he'd cut while the first batch was burning. She ate quietly for a while. Marcus stood on the other side of the counter with his coffee, and didn't fill the silence, because he'd been learning not to do that. Learning that sometimes Lily needed the silence to find her way to whatever she was carrying. She put her fork down. "Dad." "Yeah." "Are you going to be here when I get home today?" The question was simple. She asked it looking directly at him, and there was nothing guarded in her face. Nothing braced. She asked it the way a person asks when they believe the answer might actually be yes. "I'm going to be here when you get home today," he said. She nodded. picked up her fork, ate a strawberry. Then she said, quietly, almost to her plate, "I told Mrs. Alvarez that my dad is the kind of person who comes when you call him." Marcus set his coffee down because his hand was doing something he didn't want her to see. Yeah. She looked up. She said, "That's a good kind of person to have." "Mrs. Alvarez is smart," Marcus said. "I know," Lily said. "She's my teacher." She went back to her eggs. Marcus picked up his coffee. The kitchen was warm and smelled like toast, and the morning was ordinary and unremarkable, and it was the most valuable thing he had ever held in his hands. He let himself hold it.